Welcome to Buffalo Rumblings Live. My name is Matt Warren. I'm joined tonight by Dan Lavoie, who is our resident draft expert at Buffalo Rumblings. Uh, Dan, it's draft week. Are you excited?
I am so excited. This is basically my Christmas, so I've been looking forward to this for months now.
Has any of that been dampened by the fact that the Bills don't have a first round pick this year?
Honestly, it hasn't been too bad. I remember reading Anthony Marino's article last week about life without a first round pick, and I kind of have to agree with the sentiment. I've gotten to evaluate draft prospects without considering whether they deserve to be picked in the first round or not, and I could just kind of pick and choose players at random to look at, and it's a lot more relaxing that way. So it's been a more unique experience, but I think I've enjoyed it. I don't know if I'd want to keep doing it again next year, though.
Well, yeah, that brings up a lot of interesting points. Do you see the Bills trying to get back up into the first round at some point this year?
No, ultimately, I don't think it's too realistic. I know Doug Whaley brought up that they never count anything out, and with him, you definitely can't count anything out. But from all the rumblings we've heard across the draft analysis uh, space for the last month or so, what we've been hearing is that the players you're going to find at the end of the first round aren't very much better than the players in the middle of the second round, and the Bills just don't seem to have the ammunition or the real desire to go trading up into that first round. I think it's one thing if a guy like Todd Gurley is there at the bottom of the first round and he's clearly a top talent, but he might just be available based on positional needs or some injury prognosis. That could be one thing, but I don't see it happening except in a very extreme case.
So if you were picking for the Buffalo Bills, not anticipating what the Bills were going to do, but rather you are the general manager of the Buffalo Bills, uh, where would you go with that 50th overall pick, not knowing, not having sat down with Rex Ryan and gone over the roster or anything like that? Where would you lean for this Bills team?
My ultimate decision goes down to best player available, best player available, best player available. They have no glaring needs in any of their positions in this draft, and there's good enough talent that should be on the board at pick 50 that I think the Bills could just sit and take whoever's at the top of their board at that spot. And I think that's actually exactly what they plan on doing, either that or trading back and then doing that. But I would be in that same mindset. So whether it's an offensive tackle prospect like Cedric Ogbuehi or a quarterback, if there's a quarterback out there that is worthy of being a franchise guy, maybe you pick him at 50. If there's a defensive tackle or a cornerback or a safety, doesn't matter to me what position it is. All I'm looking for is who's the talented guy out there, and that's who I want to pick.
Well, so you answered my next question, which was going to be, well, what do you think the Bills are actually going to do? And you think that they're just going to sit back and draft best player available. Is there any position that might be off their board just completely because of lack of need or they don't want to spend resources on it at that number 50 spot?
I think there's a few positions that can be counted out for the Bills, at least in the second round. One of those probably would be center. They already have a starting center in Eric Wood. The class isn't great in terms of center prospects that have good top round talent. There's Cameron Irving from Florida State. He played most of his career as an offensive tackle, though, and so some people project him as a center, some project him as an offensive tackle. You also have Ali Marpet from Hobart. He is kind of in that second to third round range, but a lot of that's just because he played at a Division III school, and I think he has the talent to be worthy of being picked in the second round. Some teams are projecting him as a center, but he also was a tackle in college, but he projects more towards that guard center interior range. So I don't know if it's a pure center that the Bills would be looking for, but there technically could be options out there. I also don't think running back is in the cards. At least I'm crossing my fingers that please don't go out and pick a running back with the 50th pick because you just suddenly taken the Bills fan base and blown their minds, and I don't want to have to deal with the aftermath of that. So I'm not expecting to see a guy like Melvin Gordon or Amir Abdullah or Duke Johnson getting selected with that pick. And then pretty much everything else I think is open season, whether it's a cornerback or a safety prospect. That could happen anywhere along the defensive line. I could even see linebacker being picked. I think that that's more likely than running back, just because there is that lack of depth behind their starters. It could still happen. And anything on the offense is really fair game at this point.
R. Kemp, one of our readers that has commented on BuffaloRumblings.com in our comment section here, asks, what are the chances of them getting a future draft pick in a trade situation, and do you think it's a good idea?
I would say that I think there's a good chance of that happening. We already saw that happen last year with Doug Whaley picking up an extra fifth-rounder this year, and the Bills have made more trades than any other team in the last calendar year. So if I'm putting my money on anything, it's that the Bills are going to be trading this weekend, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a future pick thrown in there at some point. I think the Bills would want to reload for next year's draft, both because they don't have a lot of use for those later picks, as the team's kind of alluded to, and because they might want that ammunition next year if they want to trade up and get an impact player like a quarterback or like a left tackle or like a star edge rusher or something. There could be some guy who's a top 10 pick that they want to get, and they will need the ammunition for that. So, yeah, I think they would definitely consider trading away those picks and picking something up in the future.
Bills 13 MCQ wants us to discuss the quarterback situation in rounds 2 and 3. Now, what's interesting about this quarterback class is you've got those two top-tier guys that are going to go in the top 10 picks, you would think. And then there's this huge drop-off with a lot of different opinions on that next group. Do you think that the Bills will have their choice of that next group, like Bryce Petty, Brett Hundley, Grayson, whoever you want to throw into that group? So it's a two-part question. Do you think the Bills will have their choice of those guys? And which one of those guys do you think is the best fit?
Okay, so to answer that question, I'll start with I'll turn this into a three-part question. Let's talk about who would be available. Let's talk about who the Bills might want, and then I'll talk about who I might want. We'll just kind of go through that way. So in terms of the availability of those prospects, it really wouldn't surprise me to see all of the quarterbacks not named Mariota or Winston available at pick 50. This is kind of a draft that's similar to the 2013 draft when E.J. Manuel was the first quarterback selected, in that it's a very thin crop of prospects. So unlike that year, we actually have a couple guys who are considered to be top-tier talents, but then everyone below that just has a ton of question marks about them. So especially with the news that's been coming out recently, that it seems that teams just aren't enamored with Brett Hundley, who for a long time was considered the third best prospect. It sounds like the Bills would definitely have their choice of quarterback in the second round if that's what they wanted to do. From what we've been hearing about, the Bills are definitely keeping their options open for which quarterback they might want to look at. They interviewed every single quarterback at the Combine. They've talked a lot about this second tier, and Doug Whaley brought it up at the luncheon and also on WGR 550 earlier in the last few days. He mentioned a few names. He mentioned Bryce Petty. He had talked about Garrett Grayson, also Sean Mannion. He was also asked about Brett Hundley and did not sound to be enthused with Brett Hundley, called him an athletic thrower, not a passer, whereas he called Bryce Petty a passer. So in GM speak, it sure sounds like they like Bryce Petty more than they like Brett Hundley. And so I can see that if I was to rank the Bills' preference of quarterbacks based on the news that I've been hearing about those types of things, I'd say it starts with Petty at the top, and then you have Grayson, then you have Sean Mannion's kind of a question mark. He could be somewhere in that second or third spot, and then Hundley below those guys. And I think that's how that goes. It could be a smokescreen because you really never know with these guys, but I don't recall Doug Whaley being that secretive about the types of players he likes. So I think they're leaning towards Petty as their guy, and I think they're hoping they can either trade back and get him or get him in the third round, but I'm pretty sure that he's their target. Now, as for the guy that I would be interested in, I've been supporting Brett Hundley as the third best quarterback in this class pretty much since January. I still feel that way about him. I think that he's been getting pigeonholed because of his athleticism as an athletic passer, or as a run first kind of guy. EJ Manuel had to deal with the same thing when he was coming out into the draft, where he was a great athlete, but he really was a pocket passer. He had the pocket passer mentality, and I think Brett Hundley's in that similar profile where he's an athletic pocket passer. He can make all the throws. His accuracy is pretty decent. He can read the field. He wasn't allowed to make a lot of good decisions at UCLA. For example, his team wouldn't let him make audibles at the line. So this led to a few situations like defense is showing an all-out blitz, and he's sitting there in shotgun with an empty backfield, and, well, this isn't going to end well. So I think he hasn't been given a good enough of a fair chance by some of these evaluators, and I still like his NFL prospects the best out of those quarterbacks in that lower group of guys. After that, I had Garrett Grayson as my next highest ranked. I like that he went from a pro-style offense. I like that he has a good poise in the pocket. He reads the whole field. He can make throws. He doesn't have great firepower in his arm. He's not going to blow you away with his deep throws, and he's a passable athlete. He's pretty good. He's not great. But I think the talent's there for him to be kind of like a Sam Bradford level quarterback who's efficient and moves the ball down the field. And then my next rank would be Bryce Petty, which he has the tools, he has the mindset. I really liked watching him on the John Gruden QB camp, talking through tape and walking through plays and things. It sounds like he's a guy who knows what he's talking about, but he has to develop a lot of the aspects of his mechanics and of his field reading just because of his college offense. So for now, he's a projection guy. He's got to go behind those other two.
Yeah, I was listening to him on, I can't remember what show it was on. I think it was on ESPN Radio, and he was talking about how most of his pro day he was under center to kind of prove it to teams that he could operate under center. And it's the transition thing. We're never going to know until we actually see him do it, whether he can do it or not. I thought Jolly in our comment section asked a really interesting question. What's the likelihood that the Bills opt to deal EJ for picks while allowing whatever rookie they would draft in this situation behind Castle? I personally don't think that that's a very likely thing at all. I think they would have to get a pretty solid pick in order to do that. And I don't, A, see anybody offering that, and B, it would cost the Bills money against their salary cap to actually do it. I can't remember the exact dollar figure it is, and I didn't want to look it up while you were talking because I figured you would hear my keyboard clacking. But I know that it would cost the Bills money to do that. So it's going to cost them money, and they're going to give up on their former first-round draft pick for what? I mean, is the team going to offer them more than a fourth-round pick for EJ Manuel? I'm just like, that would be like the absolute ceiling that I would expect anybody to offer for him. So I don't see that happening. Is there a scenario where you see the Bills trading EJ Manuel at some time in the next 7 days?
I mean, it's not happening. I'll say that, and that's kind of as far as I would get into it. I can speculate all day because I know Doug Whaley loves to make trades. I know that the franchise is not sold on EJ Manuel at this point. I think that he could fetch a return because he did start for basically a season, and he appeared to be an average, passable, boring quarterback during those times. So I feel like some team like the Texans or the Titans could look at him and say, well, if we build the team around him, then we can do all right. If the Bills were to trade EJ Manuel, they'd have to wait until they had their new guy that they wanted, though. So that would mean they're going to have to wait until they draft, say Bryce Petty in the 50th pick or the 81st pick. So you're not looking at the Bills finding a second round or a third round pick compensation for EJ if they wanted to do that, because that time will have already passed. Maybe they could do a future pick for that, or else otherwise they're just looking at a mid-round option. And like you were saying, I don't think that's a good management of resources for the Bills to do that, both with the draft picks, with their personnel, and with the salary cap. It doesn't make sense to deal EJ this year.
Yeah, I think that guy's going to be on the roster the entire season just because it would cost them money to release him, and there's really no harm in keeping him
Right.
on the roster. I want to get to a couple different like kind of these general questions before we really get into some specific players. Here's a good question, another one from R. Kemp. Are there any needs that you think the Bills have to fill in the draft? Like there's a player that, or not a player, but a position that they have to take in order to go into the season with a full complement?
I think the Bills have to spend one of their picks in this draft on either tight end or linebacker. They have starters for both of those positions between Charles Clay and then at linebacker they have Bradham and Preston Brown. But the depth behind both positions is pretty suspect, and I would not feel confident with Ty Powell as the primary backup at linebacker. I wouldn't be confident in Chris Gregg as the primary backup tight end, who would also be getting rotational snaps. So although I don't think it would make a lot of sense to draft with your first pick, I think the Bills should be looking at getting out of the draft with at least a linebacker or a tight end, if not both, just to bolster the depth in those areas.
But there's no glaring holes that they need to address. I know that's one of the things you probably want to say. We're still talking about depth players. There's no guy that, I mean, even if they didn't get, say, an offensive guard, which would be another position I would probably put on this list, even if I don't know if that person's going to be the starting guard come opening day, it would be nice to add another guy into that mix, into that rotation. But none of it's kind of it's not even close to make or break.
Exactly. We're not talking about needs here. The Bills' needs are not really that desperate. I mean, even the area that I think has the biggest hole, so to speak, is on the defensive line, and we're basically making the assumption here that they're going to be looking at 3 down linemen with Marcel Darius, Kyle Williams, and then that third guy who right now is supposed to be Stephon Charles or Corbin Bryant. And so that would be kind of the biggest area that I think the Bills would definitely want to look for a contributor in. But other than that, it's mainly just addressing depth across the roster in this year's draft. That's what I think they'd be going for. Offensive guard, we don't have good starters, but we have numbers. We have Quanjo if he goes to guard. We have Richardson. There's Incognito, Chris Williams if he's healthy. There's Urbic. They've got guys there that can all do that. So I don't think the Bills need to come out of this draft with an offensive guard. I think it'd be great if they came out of this draft with a starting offensive guard or a starting offensive tackle. I think that's would be a great way to spend the draft pick, but I don't think it's necessary.
That's an interesting. I like the way you put that, and you list the guys. So if it comes time for, say, the 7th round pick and they haven't added a guard, it might not be to their benefit to do that because they have so much competition already. They don't need competition. They need a guy that could potentially walk in and start on day one. And I know that Seantrell Henderson was able to do that from the 7th round at the right tackle position, but I think we might be in a little bit of a different position this year. I mean, if a guy's got that many red flags and he's falling, sure.
Yeah, that was kind of a special case, but I agree. I think especially when you get down to the late round picks, you're going to struggle to find an opening on the roster, and so either the Bills should be trading those away for other picks, or they should be really focusing on what parts of the roster are lacking depth, because they don't really need starters in this draft. They just need strong contributors across the roster.
We're talking with Dan Lavoie on Buffalo Rumblings Live. He's our resident draft expert at BuffaloRumblings.com. He's going to have I think by the end of this week, 75 scouting reports up on our website at buffalorumblings.com/NFL Draft 2015. We've got something like 8 or 9 videos featuring a whole bunch of draft prospects that are up as well, where we've kind of broken it down by position. So if you have questions about specific positions, you can certainly go check those out, and then go check out Dan's scouting reports, where he's also ranked them by position group, and then overall the top 75, or not the top 75 prospects in the draft, but his 75 prospects ranked. I don't think some of those guys, like, you put them in the 7th round and 6th round prospects. It's you, just because you did a scouting report doesn't mean they're in the top 75. If that's correct.
Yeah. So you did a good job clarifying there. The players that are ranked on BuffaloRumblings.com are all the players that I evaluated in my published scouting reports this year. So the list will only go out to 75 this year, but it'll cover every single player. You'll be able to click on a link, view my scouting report that sums up what I saw on the tape and how I feel about that prospect. So it's going to range all the way down to the 7th round UDFA guys, but you'll be able to see each of those players how I had them ranked.
Griff had another general question before we start taking some questions about specific players. So if you guys want to start throwing specific player questions into the comment section, we'll do our best to get to them. I know that's Dan's favorite because he has to go and find his notes and stuff like that, so he gets to frantically use his mouse and find stuff. But he wanted to know if you guys, meaning us, watched the draft, and if so, on which network. I don't have cable. I don't have ESPN or NFL Network. So plus being the social media manager at BuffaloRumblings.com, I'm probably going to be spending most of draft time on Twitter and Facebook reacting with all of you guys, and I'll see the picks come through on Twitter. I don't need to hear Chris Berman or Mel Kiper or anything like that. But Dan, which network do you go with, and why?
I think the one that I've usually gone with has been ESPN. That dates back to living in the Rochester area when we didn't have NFL Network available. So I started watching on ESPN, and I just keep watching on there. Along with watching on ESPN, I also follow on Twitter, and everybody knows that I'm always posting in the comments sections all draft weekend on Buffalo Rumblings. And yeah, that's mainly where I get my coverage. But I tune into NFL Network if I think that they're being a little too obnoxious over there on ESPN, especially once you get to the 3rd day and they just kind of give up on the whole production. I find that NFL Network does a little bit better job of staying focused on the players going through.
That's one of the nice things about having the college coaches that NFL Network does, that you're able to get a little bit more involved with some of the picks. Tom E. Boy asks, do you think Rex will want to draft a safety?
Sure. I think they like Duke Williams, with who they have as kind of their second starter at safety right now. But they don't really have good options behind those guys. I mean, Kenny Ladler, Jonathan Meeks, who still hasn't played a snap for the Bills as far as I can recall. So if they see a guy.
Because he played a special team snap maybe or something.
I think he played in the preseason. He keeps going on IR. I feel bad for him. I hope he gets it together this year and is on the roster. But there's not proven depth behind those guys. So I think they're definitely looking at safeties. I know they checked out Byron Jones, who he's getting some projections as cornerback, but he also played some safety in college, so he could do that. So I've been hearing that about a few teams are kind of, it's not a great safety class in terms of pure safeties, but there's a lot of teams that are looking at cornerbacks that they can maybe convert to safety. And so, yeah, I think that that's a viable option, and it could very well be one of the first couple picks for the Bills.
How far down the draft board does Shane Ray fall with his pot arrests today? Could he come into play at 50? That's Matthew 62 asking.
Man, Shane Ray has been a really interesting study for me. I evaluated him. I'm going to look at the date real quick here. So when I graded Shane Ray, it was a little more than 2 months ago. And on tape, I had him looking like a top 10 pick. when I first looked at him. He's a very explosive. He's a pass rusher. So just so we can clarify for everyone, he's a pass rusher about 6'3", 245 pounds from Missouri. He had 22 tackles for loss last year, 13 sacks last year, so very productive player. He's a very explosive first step, great use of his hands. He has a great rip. He's working on a swim and a spin that are also pretty good, and he just has very strong hands that allow him to get around guys and tackle them. But being a smaller guy, he sometimes gets caught up in people's pads and can't always disengage well, and he also gets walked back against the run. Then here comes the combine, and Shane Ray has some pretty bad workouts. 3-cone drill did not do well. So it wasn't an effort thing. It was more, maybe this guy's actually more athletically limited than we thought he was. And so then you have people going back and looking at the tape, and yeah, he can't quite turn the corner as well as we were hoping. He doesn't change direction very well. So this guy started as a top 5 pick, at least in January. He's been kind of falling down the boards into the 20s range since then, and some people just aren't as high on him at all. I still think he's a first-round talent in terms of his edge rushing ability, and I really like him if he does drop to pick 50. Ultimately, when I'm looking at this arrest that I just read about, it was a marijuana possession charge, misdemeanor, so that's the kind of thing. We had a Bills player. Well, Nigel Bradham had something similar, or
Yeah, he was arrested. He was charged with a violation. It wasn't even a misdemeanor.
Right.
But he was suspended for a single game, and I believe that's because he was in the substance abuse program already.
Right. So he was already.
I'm curious. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So he was already in that program, and that's why he got the suspension. But I see kind of a similar thing happening for Shane Ray. I think he will plead it down, do some community service or something. It'll be turned into a violation, and ultimately it's not really going to affect his criminal record. And since he's just joining the NFL, he doesn't have a record with them yet, at least as far as I understand the NFL's discipline process. And so I don't think he's going to fall that far on teams' boards. Maybe to the top of the second round. And if you're looking for that sleeper guy, like, oh, maybe the Bills will trade up for somebody. Maybe it's Shane Ray. I don't think he lasts to pick 50, though, but I really like him, and I think he's a great backup for Jerry Hughes if he was available. I'd take him in a heartbeat at pick 50.
We know that Bills fans probably aren't going to be happy with who the Bills pick at number 50, but what about you, Dan? Who could they take at number 50 that would leave you? I'm trying to figure out what adjective I want to use here. Like, would you be like? I don't want to use angry, but what guy could the Bills take that would make you annoyed?
Okay. Let me scroll down my list of rankings here and go find some of those guys. Public enemy number 1 would be Demarius Randall, who is the Arizona State safety, currently ranked Mike Mayock's number 1 safety prospect for this year's draft. I have him as a 7th rounder, and a week after I did my scouting report, I saw other people breaking down his film the same way, and I don't understand what the hype is about. He really struggles to recognize plays. He finds himself out of position all the time. He is not a good tackler. He does a great job of breaking on the ball on those 5-yard slants and then taking it to the house, which looks good on a highlight reel, but doesn't tell you anything about how good of a player he is. So he feels like the kind of guy that has gotten overhyped because he had a lot of interceptions returned for touchdowns and because he had a great combine, but that would just really bother me because there are certain players in the draft that I will rank much lower than everyone else, and the Bills did draft 1 or 2 of those guys, and every time it happens, I just shake my head and.
And then you got to be right. And
yeah, well, yeah.
I wanted to
and that's why I'm working for you guys, right?
Right, exactly. That's why you're working for
But
BuffaloReport.com, the very important Buffalo Bills fan website. Dan, I wanted to clarify one thing with Mayock's rankings, and you would probably know this better than I would. Is he ranking them based on what he's hearing from teams or what he's seeing on film, or is it a mixture of both?
Supposedly, for all these guys who do their rankings, it's what they see. For guys like Kuiper and McShay, I think they absolutely are putting what the teams are saying into their rankings. It doesn't make sense why guys like Johnny Manziel suddenly jump up and Teddy Bridgewater suddenly falls down. Those types of changes are happening because they're hearing some buzz from one of their insiders that somebody's going to change. Mayock, I feel like he's always been more of the guy to watch the tape and give his evaluations about players. But with the NFL Network continuing to kind of become more of a coverage setup for the NFL draft, more of a reporting setup, and not so much an analysis setup, it wouldn't surprise me if some of what he does is based on those analyses, or based on those insiders, especially with Landon Collins kind of being the undisputed top safety all offseason. Seeing him suddenly drop down a couple weeks before draft day makes me think some scouts not happy about him.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is that Mayock only puts out his one mock draft a year, and it's right before the draft, and it's based heavily on what he's hearing from teams, and that's usually why it's pretty accurate, correct?
Yeah. So with the big draft guys, there's the mock drafts and the rankings. Sometimes you get a big board too that has all the players ranked against all of each other, and other times it's just the positional rankings. But yeah, with those guys, because they have the connections, their goal is to try to line up picks to players. And if they can say the Miami Dolphins like Todd Gurley, then they want to try to get Todd Gurley and Miami Dolphins associated with each other as soon as they can. And that's how they do their process. So to a certain extent, Mayock can keep his evaluations without that, but especially once you get close to draft day, there's a lot of temptation to just try to be right.
Uh, what other draft prospects you want to talk about tonight? People aren't asking about specific guys like I was anticipating they would. What other guys did you want to mention, talk about tonight before we get into a couple final questions here that have been posted in the comments?
Let's talk about guards for the second round. I just want to kind of give some thoughts about. I don't think the Bills really would want a guard in the second round, but we can certainly bring those up because I know a lot of viewers and readers were interested in guards pretty much all off season. So I'll just kind of talk about how I see that situation going. I think if the Bills are drafting a guard in the second round, it's because he's a versatile player and he can play another position. So either it's a guard who can play center or it's a guard who can play tackle, or at least fake it at tackle. The top sleeper in my mind is Ali Marpet. I think that there's a very distinct chance the Bills would pick him in the second round just because he can play center. He gives them that ability to use a backup for Eric Wood if they don't want to keep Craig Urbick around, or they can have two backup centers available to them. I think he's been severely underrated all offseason because he played a Division III school. A couple weeks ago, I went back and watched his Senior Bowl tape again, and every play, this guy is running down, blocking guys 3 yards downfield. He's moving up to the second level, blocking out linebackers. He has more power than people are giving him credit for, and he combines that with good mobility. He's still growing into his frame. He has good technique, but it can still get better. I think this is a guy whose trajectory is just going up and up and up, and the Bills probably aren't getting him in the third round because I feel like some team's going to pounce on him before then. I wouldn't be surprised if they went on him in the second round. If they're going for a guard prospect, I think Ali Marpet makes the most sense, even ahead of Laken Tomlinson from Duke, even ahead of A.J. Cann or some of those other guys. I think that Ali Marpet is probably who I would be keeping an eye on as the Bills, if the Bills were going offensive line.
Okay. I've got one more question here from Sergeant Major Thor, and it actually is more serious than I anticipated when I first read it. I know I just set that up completely, but nobody's talked about it. But what's going on with the whole kicker thing? Do you think the Bills will at least look at taking a guy that can be an accurate field goal kicker and a kickoff guy instead of keeping two specialists? First of all, I don't think Rex Ryan's going to keep two specialists. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. They just re-signed their kickoff specialist um, to a league minimum 2-year contract, so I don't think it would be um, too difficult to get rid of him if they wanted to. But SMT sees it as a wasted roster spot. Is there a kicker that could come in and do both of those jobs that you would be willing to give up what Dan Carpenter brings to the table in field goals?
I mean, I want to give this question a fair shake. I'll be honest, Thor, that they don't make kicker film available to us, or at least I'm not going to go out and seek the college teams and find the Central Michigan punter and find out if he does a good job or not. There's guys out there, I'm sure, that could handle that sort of thing, but they're not on my radar, especially given that the Bills do have established guys for both punter and kicker who can already handle that. As far as if they want to keep Jordan Gay around and have their kickoff guy who can kick field goals or punt, it wouldn't surprise me if the Bills wanted to get a replacement and maybe let go one or the other of their starting kicker or punter and kind of use that hybrid guy. But at the same time, I think they really do appreciate having a backup who can handle either of those spots and just have him on the roster. And I mean, they were content to use him last year. It worked out pretty well. They improved their kickoff coverage. They were able to let Dan Carpenter focus on his kicking, and that worked out for them. We were wondering if that was a Marrone thing, but I think the fact that they re-signed Jordan Gay this year and they kept him around on a 2-year contract, even though it's minimum salary, I mean, the guy is still a backup kicker, so minimum salary is kind of market value. So I don't think they undervalued him or anything. I do think they're interested in keeping him around at least through training camp and just seeing, is he going to make sense with the scheme? We also did keep Danny Crossman, the special teams coordinator, so he's familiar with Gay. He knows what he can do, and he knows what he brings to the team. So I think they want to keep him around, and if they find a guy in the draft that they think can do that role, they might pick him, but I think that role is going to stick around on the roster this year.
Dan, are you going to be tweeting during the draft, or are you going to be mostly commenting on BuffaloRumblings.com?
Well, I don't have any of those fancy Twitter application things that let me multitask very well, so I'm gonna stick to Buffalo Rumblings during the draft weekend, and I know I'll also kind of be out and about here and there. I'm not sure quite what my situation will look like for the first day of the draft, given that the Bills aren't really picking. But yeah, you can find me at Buffalo Rumblings, lurking in the comments section.
Well, great. We'll make sure we tweet out some of your thoughts to the masses that are following on Twitter, and we'll put them on Facebook too. You can make sure you take a look at all of Dan's draft work. He's been killing it all off season and from before at BuffaloRumblings.com/NFL Draft 2015. His scouting reports are awesome. The videos that we have done, I think his information is great. I'm still the host. Sorry, I can't really change that. But there's great information on the site. Make sure you stay tuned to BuffaloRumblings.com and at BuffRumblings on Twitter with all of the Bills draft coverage from throughout the weekend. And Dan, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thanks for taking all the questions from the Bills fans out there that really don't know how to be specific without the first-round draft pick. So it's
I understand.
A general overview.
I mean, I'll say that of the guys that we've had that I've been looking at, I have 75 names on this list. It wouldn't surprise me if one of the picks for the Bills, if the first pick for the Bills isn't on that list. I've been looking at names, and I just keep saying, oh, this guy could be a second-rounder. This guy could be a second-rounder. And it's a lot harder. It's hard enough trying to figure out who they're going to pick in the first round, and then you wait 50 picks and you try that again. Yeah, good luck to everybody out there trying to follow along this year, but it'll be a fun ride.
Well, I look forward to your second round mock draft on Friday morning when we can get a much better handle on who's going to be available, and we can do a top 20 board. It'll be great. It'll be
Yeah.
great. All right, thanks, Dan.
All right. Thanks,
Have a
man.
good one, guys. We'll see you all this during the draft week.
Yep.